Sophia arrived at that ranch carrying a debt that wasn't hers, in a winter that cut right to the bone, and she left there with something that no business arrangement could ever have foreseen. She didn't go looking for love. She went looking for dignity. And sometimes, when we least expect it, both things arrive together through the same door in the same freezing winter. But before getting there, let me ask you something. Have you ever been judged before opening your mouth? Before taking a single step? Before showing the world who you really are? Before having any chance to defend yourself? Because Sophia Vance was. And Arthur Drummond was too. And the two of them spent entire weeks hating each other with all the conviction in the world, based on a story that had never been true. A well-told lie, repeated with patience by someone who needed the two of them to remain apart for a reason that would still take some time to come to light. This happened in the winter of 1931, in the rugged mountains of Montana, in a region where the January cold sweeps down from the mountain peaks and settles into your bones as if it owns the place. In the town of Bozeman and on the ranches that spread across the frozen plains around it, where the morning fog erased the outlines of the ancient ponderosa pines and the world seemed smaller, heavier, older than it was. Where the smell of damp pine and cold earth was the first thing that entered your nose every morning, and where the stories people told about each other carried the same weight as signed documents. Before I continue, I need you to do something. Write down here in the comments where you're watching this story from. It could be your city, your state, or even just a hello. I always get curious to know who is on the other side because it's these people who make this channel exist. If you are here for the first time, welcome to the Tales of Yesteryear channel. Here we tell stories that time almost erased, but that the heart refuses to forget. Subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you don't miss any new stories. And now, come with me to the winter of 1931. Ernest Vance was a good man whom life had treated with a harshness that didn't match the size of the kindness he possessed. The son of a farmer, the grandson of a farmer, he had inherited a medium-sized homestead on the outskirts of Bozeman, on a hillside that caught the afternoon sun and had a good freshwater spring at the back of the property. He wasn't rich, but for years he had managed to support his family with that simple dignity of someone who owes nothing to anyone and sleeps peacefully because the day's work was honest. Sophia was the eldest daughter. She was 23 in that December of 1931, with dark, thick hair that she tamed into a heavy braid, dark green eyes that in the winter seemed even deeper, and that way of walking straight that people sometimes mistook for arrogance, but which was something else entirely. It was self-awareness. It was the posture of someone who learned early on that keeping your spine straight isn't a luxury. It's a necessity. Sophia's mother, Martha, had died of pneumonia when Sophia was 16, in a winter that the local folks still called the long winter of 24, because the cold didn't break for almost 4 straight months, and the fog got so thick that sometimes you could barely see your hand in front of your face. After that, the homestead slowly lost what little balance it had. Ernest sank into a long, silent grief, and the years went by with the bills slowly piling up like water filling a bucket with leaks that no one had the time to fix. Sophia learned to read with Aunt Margaret, her mother's sister, who had been a teacher in a rural schoolhouse before getting married, and who continued teaching anyone who wanted to learn in her own living room without charging a dime. It was an uncommon thing in those days for a woman of that background and situation. But Sophia had a hunger for words that no hardship could extinguish. She read anything that fell into her hands, old primers, farmers' almanacs, letters that the neighbors asked her to write, hand-copied recipes that the local women traded. Words were the place where Sophia felt the most whole, the most herself, the place where no debt could reach her. But concrete life isn't solved with reading. And Ernest's debt to Arthur Drummond had grown over 3 years of small loans that turned into a sum too large to be ignored. The first loan had been to pay the veterinarian when half the herd fell ill during a difficult winter. The second to buy seeds after an unseasonal frost destroyed the crops before they had time to harvest. The third to rebuild the roof that hadn't withstood a hailstorm that was as thick and sudden as a biblical punishment. Each loan on its own seemed like a manageable thing. Together with the interest that quietly accrued underneath, they became a weight that Ernest could no longer lift. Sophia had known Arthur Drummond's name since she was a little girl, and she knew his reputation, or rather she knew the reputation that Raymond Hayes, Arthur's brother-in-law and the ranch manager, had spread throughout the region over the years with that patience of a man planting seeds for a distant harvest. Raymond was a constant presence at the town markets, in the conversations at Miller's General Store, at the gatherings of freighters and merchants. He knew everyone's name, remembered birthdays, and passed along messages for travelers. And he always had a story on the tip of his tongue, told with that tone of someone who is revealing something reluctantly, as if the truth were too heavy to carry alone. And the story Raymond told about Arthur was always the same, with minor variations that served to further confirm what had been said before. Arthur Drummond, Raymond would say with a sigh that seemed like genuine sorrow, was a man with no human warmth. He inherited the lands from his father and never had to truly sweat, and the money left him cold inside. The loans he gives aren't favors, they are traps. He lends to those he knows won't be able to pay. He waits, and then he takes the land. It had already happened to at least 3 families that Raymond knew by name. A man with a refined business sense and a coarse soul. Ever since his wife died, he got even worse. He shut himself tight like an iron door. Sophia had heard this story in at least 4 versions over the years, from different mouths, and every time she heard it, the image that remained was the same. A calculating man who used the needs of others as an instrument. Once, at Miller's General Store, she had heard the wife of Gerald, the travelling salesman from Billings, saying that Arthur Drummond had taken the land of a cousin's father for a 3-year-old debt. That he had waited the 3 years like a cat waiting on a mouse, with no rush, no warning, and that when the deadline arrived he hadn't even shown up personally to talk. He had just sent the paperwork through the county clerk. Another time, leaving Sunday service, Widow Higgins had whispered that the man wouldn't even open his mouth to say good morning, that he walked through town as if people were fence posts, and that when his wife was alive he was different. But that after she died, he became just like carved stone. Every story Sophia heard was a brick in a wall she was building before she even arrived, and that wall was far too solid when she climbed into Ben's wagon on that December morning. When she found out her father had a debt with this man, she felt her stomach tighten in a way she only felt when something was truly going wrong. And when Ernest came home on a grey afternoon in November of 1931, with his hat in his hand, his shoulders slumped, and the red eyes of someone who hasn't slept properly in weeks, and told her what had been agreed upon, Sophia stood still in the kitchen for a long time, staring at the wood stove as if the fire held the answer she needed. The agreement was as follows. Since the debt couldn't be paid in cash within a reasonable time frame, Ernest Vance pledged his daughter's presence at the Drummond Ranch for the period necessary to settle what he owed. Sophia would work in the main house in whatever duties were assigned, and a fixed amount would be deducted from the debt each month. The contract had been drawn up by Raymond himself, who had positioned himself as an intermediary, saying he was doing Ernest a favor by convincing Arthur to accept this kind of arrangement instead of seeking other ways to execute the debt. Sophia listened to it all. She stayed silent for longer than her father expected, looking down at her own hands on the kitchen table. Then she asked Ernest in a quiet, low voice that was more dangerous than a scream if he understood what he was doing. Ernest answered yes, keeping his eyes on the floor. That he had no choice. That he needed time to reorganize the homestead, and that it was the only way he had found. That Arthur was a man of his word, at least in that regard. That she would be safe. That it was work. Nothing more than that. Sophia went to her bedroom that night and stayed awake until dawn, listening to the wind in the ponderosa pines outside. That long, low sound, which was the oldest sound she knew. She didn't cry, because she wasn't cut from the cloth of those who cry when they are angry, and what she felt was anger. Anger at her father for letting it get this far without asking for help sooner. Anger at Arthur Drummond for being the kind of man who would accept such a thing without blinking. And a deeper, quieter anger, with no exact address, which was the anger at the situation, at being a woman in a world that treated women as bargaining chips when the numbers didn't add up. But the next day, even before the sun came up, Sophia got out of bed, lit the stove, made the coffee, sat across from her father at the kitchen table, and said she would go. That she was going because the family needed it, and not because she had no choice, because there is always a choice, and this was hers. That she was going with her head held high, not with her head bowed, and that when the debt was settled, she would return, and the homestead would be in order, and never again would the Vance name depend on the Drummond name, or any other. Ernest looked at his daughter with that mixture of relief and shame that corrodes more than any accusation. He placed his hand over hers on the table and couldn't say much besides an apology that Sophia accepted with a nod. She spent 3 days preparing. She washed and folded the clothes she had, which weren't many, but were kept in good order. She passed on the responsibilities of the kitchen and the garden to her younger siblings, with a detailed list written in clear handwriting pasted on the wall. Aunt Margaret came to visit her on the eve of her departure and sat on the porch for 2 hours, talking with that lightness of someone who knows the weight is there, but chooses not to add to it. She didn't try to convince Sophia not to go. Instead, she got up in the middle of the conversation, went to the bedroom, and came back with a book in her hand. It was a collection of stories by Jane Austen, with a worn cover and pages yellowed from so much use, which her aunt had been given when she was a young woman. She placed it in her niece's hand and simply said it was so Sophia wouldn't lose her bearings, that a reading woman never entirely loses herself. Sophia kissed her aunt's forehead, packed the book at the bottom of her suitcase, and didn't sleep for more than 3 hours that night. On the morning of her departure, on the 2nd of December 1931, the fog was so thick it erased the tree line of the ponderosa pines at the back of the property. The cold was that dry mountain cold that catches in your throat on the very first breath of the morning. Ernest had managed to get her a ride with Ben the teamster, who was passing down the road that led to the Drummond Ranch on his way to the market in Livingston, and knew the trails of that region like the back of his hand. Sophia hugged her siblings quickly, lowered her head to receive her father's blessing with a stiffness that wasn't coldness. It was containment, the kind you use when things absolutely cannot spill over. And she climbed into the wagon with her small suitcase on her lap. She didn't look back, not because she didn't want to, because she knew that if she looked, she would see her father's face in the doorway, with that expression she couldn't bear without something inside her breaking in a way that would take time to put back together. So she faced forward, watching the dirt road opening up through the fog, as if the world were being invented step by step, and she breathed in the smell of pine and damp earth that was the smell of the mountains in winter, and let the morning silence and the rattling of the wagon be the only things in the world for a while. Ben was a man of few words, which Sophia appreciated. After about 20 minutes on the road, he mentioned that he knew the Drummond Ranch from a distance, that it was well organized and large, that Arthur Drummond was a man respected by those who worked closely with him. Sophia didn't respond to what seemed like an embedded compliment. She looked out to the side, at the wet wooden fences passing by, and kept to her thoughts. The Drummond Ranch appeared when the wagon turned a bend in the road, and the fog, by some chance of the wind, had cleared a little right there. The main house sat atop a gentle rise, its dark stone facade framed by carved wood, with tall windows and a long porch that stretched across the entire front. All around, the barns and granaries were well maintained, painted in a faded ochre that time had weathered to just the right shade. The pastures opened up on both sides, with the prairie grass silvered by the early frost, and a few heads of cattle grazing in the distance between the fences. Further back, in a semicircle enclosing it all, stood the dark, quiet line of the ancient ponderosa pines. It was beautiful. Sophia didn't want to think it was beautiful, but it was. Ben stopped the wagon at the main gate. Sophia stepped down alone, grabbed her suitcase, thanked him with a nod, and stood there for a moment, looking at the uneven stone path that sloped gently up to the porch. The cold felt good on her face. She took a deep breath, lifted her chin, and started walking up. It was Raymond who appeared first. He came out the side door of the main house with quick steps and a smile that settled on his face a full second before it reached his eyes. That kind of smile Sophia had learned to recognize early on, the kind that serves a purpose other than greeting. He was a tall, broad man with neatly combed greying hair and a trimmed moustache, well-dressed for a rural setting, wearing a vest and a watch chain that swayed as he stepped down the 2 stairs of the porch. He seemed genuinely enthusiastic to see her, in a way she didn't quite know how to interpret yet. Raymond called her by her last name, said she was very welcome, that her bags could go to the room that was already prepared, that her duties would be explained by Mrs. Gable. He spoke quickly, with that fluency of someone who is always one step ahead of the conversation, steering it without seeming like he's steering. He asked about the trip, about her father, if it had been too cold on the road. Sophia answered briefly and politely, without feeding the small talk. Raymond didn't seem to mind. As they walked along the porch, he went on to say that Arthur was a very busy man, that he probably wouldn't appear before lunch, and then he added, with a calculated lightness that Sophia felt on her skin without being able to name it at the time, that she didn't need to be afraid of Arthur, that his manner was rough and closed off, that he rarely spoke more than necessary, but that it was just his way, that if she did her work diligently and stayed in her lane, everything would go well. It was a warning disguised as advice. Sophia registered both things. Mrs. Gable was in the kitchen when Raymond walked in with Sophia. She was a short, solid woman, with black hair streaked with white, pulled back into a loose bun, a thick cotton apron, and dark eyes that evaluated everything without rushing and without apparent judgment. Raymond made the introduction with that smile and left. Mrs. Gable kept looking at Sophia for 3 whole seconds, like someone checking for something that only she knows what it is. Then she turned back to the wood stove and said, without any ceremony, that the coffee was still hot and that Sophia could sit down before starting, because arrival day was arrival day. Sophia sat down. She drank the coffee, which was strong and had the smoky taste of good pine wood. Mrs. Gable worked in silence for a while, stirring a pot of beans that smelled of garlic and bay leaves, and then, without turning around, she said that Sophia must have heard plenty of things about Arthur before arriving. Sophia said she had heard some things, yes. Mrs. Gable said, still with her back turned, that people who arrived at the ranch after hearing things about Arthur usually needed some time to forget what they'd heard, or at least to put it aside, that preconceived notions cloud a person's vision. Sophia asked what that meant specifically. Mrs. Gable finally turned around, drying her hands on her apron with a calmness that was almost pedagogical, and said she didn't mean anything specific, that everyone drew their own conclusions in due time, and that for now the dried beans needed to be sorted before lunch. Sophia took the basin of dried beans and started sorting. Arthur Drummond walked into the kitchen at 20 past noon, his footsteps making no sound, which Sophia hadn't expected from a man of that build. She had her back to him, stirring a pot, and only knew he had arrived because Mrs. Gable, without stopping what she was doing, straightened her posture slightly, that almost imperceptible adjustment of someone acknowledging an important presence without needing to look. Sophia turned around slowly. She wasn't going to show she had been startled. Arthur Drummond was taller than she had imagined. Easily 6 feet, with broad shoulders, that his thick dark wool coat made obvious anyway, and very dark hair with the beginnings of grey at the temples that hadn't quite taken over yet. He had the kind of face that wasn't handsome in the easy sense of a magazine illustration. It was a weathered face, with a firm jaw and the lines carved by years of sun and outdoor work, and brown eyes so dark that in the low light of the kitchen they looked almost black. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't frowning. He was simply neutral, like someone who hasn't yet decided how to feel about what he's seeing, or who has learned not to decide too quickly. The two stood looking at each other for a few seconds. Arthur was the first to speak. He stated her last name as if it were a confirmation he was making to himself, Vance, and Sophia answered yes, in the same tone, neither softer nor harder than his. Arthur looked at her for another moment, with that cold evaluation she had already anticipated, but which still bothered her when it actually happened. Then he said that Mrs. Gable would explain her work duties, that the ranch had an established routine, and that he expected that routine to be respected. Sophia answered that she understood, with a clarity that wasn't sharpness but wasn't submission either. Arthur kept looking at her for another second, as if he had expected a different answer, then turned to Mrs. Gable, asked if lunch was almost ready, received a yes in response, and went to the dining room without another word. Sophia watched his back disappearing through the door. Mrs. Gable stood looking at Sophia with a smile that was just in the corner of her mouth. She said she could serve in 5 minutes. Sophia nodded and started slicing the bread. Arthur ate lunch in the dining room, as was his habit. Raymond went in there as well. Sophia stayed in the kitchen with Mrs. Gable, listening to the muffled voices through the thick wall, without being able to make out the words and without trying to. She was preoccupied with what she had seen, with how it hadn't matched what she expected. The man she had imagined, based on years of repeated stories, was someone with a visible cruelty, the coldness of an exploiter. What she had seen in those 3 minutes was different. It wasn't warm. It wasn't welcoming. But there was something in those dark eyes that she couldn't yet name, something that wasn't malice. It was distance, like someone behind very thick glass, looking out from a place where they had been locked inside for a long time. She wasn't going to jump to conclusions. She had arrived only a few hours ago. But the thought stayed there like a shard of glass in a shoe, too small to stop everything, too big to ignore. That night, in the small, clean room located down the side hallway of the main house, with a window facing the south pasture and a woolen quilt folded over the bed, Sophia lay down and stared at the dark wooden ceiling. The room smelled of dried lavender, which Mrs. Gable had hung in a bundle above the window, and the smell was familiar enough to hurt slightly because it reminded her of Aunt Margaret's house. She lay there listening to the sounds of this new house, the wood settling in the cold, the wind against the roof shingles, the distant sound of an animal out in the pasture. A house has its own sounds, a kind of breathing, and Sophia spent a good part of that night learning the breathing of the Drummond Ranch, cataloguing what was normal and what was just the winter doing what winter does. She lay thinking about Arthur Drummond, about the 3 minutes she had shared with him, about the neutrality in his gaze that didn't fit with the cold calculation Raymond had described, about how the kitchen was warm and well-stocked, which wasn't the mark of a neglectful household, about how Mrs. Gable had a way of caring for things that doesn't come from obligation, about how the wagon full of firewood had gone out to the smaller settlement on a Saturday morning before she even arrived, which meant it was a habit, not a performance. She wasn't going to jump to conclusions. It was too early, and she knew that anger had a bad habit of filtering what you see. But she kept those details filed away, organized in the same place where she kept important information, waiting for what would come next. The first 3 days were a negotiation of territory without anyone speaking openly about it. Sophia learned the routine with the precision of someone who doesn't want to leave any openings. Wake up before 6, light the stove, prepare breakfast, handle the cleaning of the main house, help Mrs. Gable with the meals, and in the afternoon shifts take care of the laundry and organization. It was heavy work but familiar, no heavier than what she did at the homestead, and Sophia was the type who preferred to keep her hands busy rather than sitting still with her thoughts. Arthur crossed paths with her a few times a day, almost always in passing. Once in the hallway when she was coming down with the clean laundry and he was going up. Once on the porch when she was sweeping and he was heading out to the pasture with the ranch hands. Once in the kitchen when she was fetching water and he passed through the back of the house. In none of these encounters did he say more than what was strictly necessary, if he spoke at all. She answered in the exact same measure, polite, direct, efficient. That night, in the small, clean room located down the side hallway of the main house, with a window facing the south pasture and a woolen quilt folded over the bed, Sophia lay down and stared at the dark wooden ceiling. The room smelled of dried lavender, which Mrs. Gable had hung in a bundle above the window, and the smell was familiar enough to hurt slightly, because it reminded her of Aunt Margaret's house. She lay there listening to the sounds of this new house, the wood settling in the cold, the wind against the roof shingles, the distant sound of an animal out in the pasture. A house has its own sounds, a kind of breathing, and Sophia spent a good part of that night learning the breathing of the Drummond Ranch, cataloguing what was normal and what was just the winter doing what winter does. She lay thinking about Arthur Drummond, about the minutes she had shared with him, about the neutrality in his gaze that didn't completely fit with the deliberate calculation Raymond had described, about how the kitchen was warm and well-stocked, which wasn't the mark of a neglectful household, about how Mrs. Gable had a way of caring for things that doesn't come from imposed obligation. These were facts, not conclusions. She wasn't going to draw conclusions too early because she knew that anger had a bad habit of filtering what you see. But she kept those details filed away, waiting for what would come. There was also the afternoon of the second day when she went to the well in the backyard to fetch water for the stove, and the bucket was jammed on the pulley with a twist she couldn't undo. She stood there trying for about 5 minutes, her fingers freezing against the cold iron of winter, until she heard footsteps behind her. It was Arthur, coming from the barn. He stopped, looked at the jammed bucket, stepped closer without saying a word, unlocked the pulley with a precise motion that showed it wasn't his first time, and handed the full bucket to her. He didn't say anything. He walked away. Sophia stared at the bucket for a second and then went into the kitchen. In that gesture, there was no calculated generosity nor performative harshness. It was just a practical action from someone who saw a problem and solved it. It was too small to be decisive, but it was real, and small, real things accumulate over time. Raymond, on the contrary, appeared with a frequency that wasn't exactly discreet. He would come into the kitchen to drink coffee at odd hours, leaning against the doorframe, talking about general matters, always with that smile that his eyes didn't participate in. Sophia noticed that he always found a way to ask, in different variations, how she was being treated, if she had any problems, if Arthur had said anything that bothered her. And when she answered that everything was fine, there was a slight disappointment on his face, too quick to be called disappointment if you weren't paying attention, but it was there. Sophia was paying attention. On the fourth day, after dinner, when the two of them were alone in the kitchen, Mrs. Gable washing the large pots and Sophia drying, the cook said, without preamble and without looking up, that Raymond had come to the ranch 8 years ago, right after Arthur's wife died, when Arthur was at the lowest point she had ever seen a man still standing, and that since then he had been taking up space with the patience of a weed, so slowly that by the time you notice, it's already everywhere. Sophia asked, also without preamble, if Arthur knew that. Mrs. Gable offered a smile that was more sadness than irony. She said that Arthur knew a lot about ranching and very little about what happened around him, that either this was how he had arrived or how he had come to be, and sometimes she couldn't tell the difference. She added nothing more, but Sophia kept that tucked away as she walked down the long hallway holding the oil lamp, listening to the winter wind in the ponderosa pines outside, making that low, continuous sound that felt like the breathing of something much older than any debt. On the fifth day, a Saturday morning with a weak but persistent winter sun, Sophia was hanging laundry on the clothesline beside the house when she saw Arthur crossing the field with two men she didn't recognize, pushing a wagon loaded with firewood. It was a lot of wood, much more than the ranch would consume in weeks. She watched without wanting to look like she was watching, continuing the motion of hanging the clothes. The wagon stopped in front of a side gate that opened onto a service road heading toward the smaller settlement about 2 miles away. Arthur walked ahead, opened the gate, and followed alongside the wagon. He returned almost 2 hours later on foot, with his shoulders slightly looser than usual, a small difference that Sophia only noticed because she had started looking at him in a way she herself hadn't quite realized yet. At lunch, Sophia asked Mrs. Gable where the wagon full of wood had gone that morning. Mrs. Gable stopped slicing the sweet potatoes for a second, thought about it, then went back to slicing. She said that every winter Arthur sent firewood to the poorest families in the area, always very dry pine, which catches easily and lasts. He had been doing this for years, since his father who did it before him, and he never mentioned it to anyone, never asked for any recognition. When someone thanked him, he would say it was surplus from the ranch and change the subject. Sophia sat in silence, staring at the knife on the cutting board. She said that no one she had spoken to before coming had ever mentioned this. Mrs. Gable offered a smile that was almost sad. She said that Raymond had a habit of curating what he told people about his brother-in-law, that he chose very carefully what stayed and what disappeared. Sophia finished helping with lunch without saying another word. But something had shifted in the place where she kept her certainties, a small thing, but one that makes a noise when it moves. The library was on the second floor of the main house, in a room that Sophia had assumed was a locked storage closet, until she discovered that the door wasn't locked. It was just closed. It was on the 6th day, on an afternoon when she had finished her chores earlier than expected, and found herself not knowing what to do with her free time, that she opened that door out of curiosity and found what she found. The bookshelves went from floor to ceiling on 3 walls. Books organized with care, free of dust, which meant someone came up here regularly to tend to them. A dark wooden table in the center with 2 high-backed chairs, a window that looked out over the pastures and the distant line of ponderosa pines. The winter afternoon light came in low and amber-colored, as it always does in the hours before dusk, when the sun is too low to warm anything, but too high not to color everything. And the smell was that specific scent of old books that Sophia had loved since Aunt Margaret, that hard-to-name blend of paper, time, and something else she could never quite put into words, but which always made her chest open up a little. She stepped inside. She ran her hand along the shelves with that lightness of someone who doesn't want to cause harm. She read some titles. There were American classics, Emerson, Hawthorne, Thoreau. There were books on the history of the Americas and Europe. There were natural science almanacs and some volumes in Old English that she didn't recognize, but whose titles on the spine sparked her curiosity. There was also, on a lower shelf near the window, a selection of poetry. She pulled one out, John Keats, opened to a random page and read the first verse her eyes landed on. She stayed. She didn't plan to stay. She sat in the chair near the window for perhaps an hour and a half. When the light began to fade and the pasture outside started turning more grey than gold, she closed the book, placed it carefully in the exact spot she had taken it from, and left. In the second-floor hallway, she crossed paths with Arthur, who was coming up the stairs. They both stopped at the same time, as if the narrow hall demanded a negotiation of who would go first. There was a moment of recognition in Arthur's eyes, brief but clear. He knew she had been in the library. His dark eyes darted from her to the closed door and back to her. He didn't say anything. He stepped down one stair to the side, leaving room in the hallway, and continued up. Sophia passed, went down the stairs, and headed to the kitchen. That night, after dinner, when she reached her room holding the oil lamp and was getting ready for bed, she found a book on the small table in the hallway, right next to her bedroom door. It hadn't been there before dinner, she was sure of it. It was a collection of stories by Thomas Hardy, bound in dark leather, the pages still crisp, with a green ribbon marker placed between the third and fourth stories. There was no note. There was no name. There was just the book, placed there with a precision that only exists when someone thinks about the gesture before making it. Sophia stood looking at it for an amount of time she didn't measure. Then she walked into her room. She closed the door softly and began to read. The weeks of December passed by with the cold deepening, the mornings arriving with thicker frost on the vegetable leaves, and the nights growing longer than the days. The routine at the Drummond Ranch had a rhythm that Sophia learned to know even by its sounds. The noise of the barn doors at 5:30 in the morning, when the ranch hands arrived, the smell of strong coffee spreading through the house before 6, the sound of hooves in the pasture in the late afternoon when the cattle were brought in, the wood cracking in the kitchen stove right before bed. If you are following this story and haven't subscribed to the channel yet, take a moment now and ring the bell, because there are a lot of beautiful stories coming your way, and leave a comment letting me know what you think so far. Within that routine, Sophia did her work with the same deliberate excellence of the early days, but without the initial rigidity. She still kept her distance. She still answered Arthur in the exact measure he used with her. But something had changed in the quality of the silence between them. It was a different silence, less hostile, more charged with unspoken things that, little by little, you begin to notice the way you notice the smell of rain before it falls. And in the open channel of the library, very slowly, without either of them calling it a channel or acknowledging that it was open, something started to happen. The second book appeared 6 days after the first, on a Monday morning on the same hallway table. It was a volume of essays by Ralph Waldo Emerson that Sophia had never read. She finished it in 3 days, because during her free moments in the afternoon, she would go to the library and read, sitting in the chair near the window, which had become, without any formal conversation about it, her spot. Once while reading, she heard footsteps in the hallway and recognized them as Arthur's before the door even moved. But the door didn't open. The footsteps stopped, lingered for about 10 seconds outside, and then walked away. Sophia lifted her eyes from the page and stared at the closed door. She sat thinking about what a man who stops in front of a door for 10 seconds and then walks away is thinking about. She didn't reach a conclusion. She went back to her book. When she finished Emerson, she left the book on the hallway table with a folded piece of paper inside, a 3-line note written in the clear, slanted handwriting that Aunt Margaret had taught her. The book was excellent. The essay on society and solitude was her favorite, and she wanted to know if there were more by the same author. She didn't sign her name, which was unnecessary. There was only one person in that house who could have left that note. The next day, there were two books on the table, both by Emerson, one of poetry and one of prose, and on top of both, a folded piece of paper. Sophia opened it. The handwriting was firm, vertical, unadorned. It simply said, "The essay on society and solitude is one of the best, but the essay on self-reliance is more honest. See if you agree." Sophia stood smiling at that folded piece of paper for about 15 seconds before she realized she was smiling. She folded it back, put it in her apron pocket, and went to the kitchen. She went to read the essay on self-reliance that same afternoon, and disagreed completely. She left this written on another sheet of paper on the little table, with full arguments and a handwriting that was firmer than it needed to be. 2 days later, there was a response that was longer than the previous one, with references to other works by Emerson that supported Arthur's position. Sophia replied to that response, and thus began a correspondence of notes on the hallway table that was the strangest and most natural thing Sophia had experienced up to that point. Two adults debating literature on folded paper, without ever speaking about it face to face, as if that little table were neutral territory where the rules of distance that applied in the rest of the house simply were suspended. What made it all even more interesting and harder to ignore was the fact that they genuinely disagreed. It wasn't mere politeness. It wasn't a performance. Arthur had strong opinions and solid arguments, and when she tore down one argument with a better counter-argument, the next response was even more meticulously crafted. There was a mind inside that man that read carefully and thought rigorously, and this was, Sophia admitted to herself with some reluctance, considerably more interesting than would have been convenient. Mrs. Gable noticed. She noticed the book that went back to the shelf with a different slip of paper marking the page than the one it had left with. She noticed that Arthur sometimes went up to the second floor in the afternoon, when it wasn't the time to be doing anything up there. She noticed that Sophia, who had arrived with that posture made of stone, had a way of sitting in the kitchen at night that was slightly different, softer around the edges, like ice that hasn't melted, but has lost its sharp edge. There was a Wednesday morning when Arthur was finishing breakfast, and Sophia walked into the kitchen to grab a dish towel. He had a book open next to his coffee cup, something he sometimes did when he was alone, and she recognized the volume in a way that made him realize she had recognized it. It was the Thomas Hardy book he had left on the hallway table during the first week. There was a split second of crossed glances that lasted exactly as long as it lasts when neither person wants to be the first to look away. Arthur went back to his cup. Sophia grabbed her dish towel, but there was an imperceptible lightness in both of them that only Mrs. Gable, who knew the faces in that kitchen better than anyone, could identify. There was also a Thursday afternoon when Sophia was in the library and Arthur walked in, went to the shelf where the almanacs were kept, and instead of grabbing what he needed on the first try, he stood there for about 2 minutes running his hand over the spines like someone searching, but who actually already knows exactly where the thing they want is. Sophia, without taking her eyes off her own page, said that the Natural Sciences Almanac was on the second shelf, third from the left. There was a pause. Arthur replied that he was looking for a different almanac, but a few seconds later he grabbed exactly the Natural Sciences one, second shelf, third from the left, and left without another word. Sophia waited to hear his footsteps fade away before lifting her eyes from the book and letting out the smile she had been holding back. It was these things, these small, specific things that had no official name, but that the two people involved knew by heart. The way he sometimes walked past with the oil lamp in the hallway late at night and slowed his pace when passing her bedroom door, not stopping, just walking slower. The way she served breakfast and left his cup in its exact spot on the table with a detail different from other times. A piece of gingerbread that Mrs. Gable had made the day before, without saying a word, without explaining. The way they sometimes crossed paths on the porch at dusk and stood in silence looking out over the fields with an arm's length of distance between them, and neither of them moved closer or further away. And that arm's length said more than half the words they had exchanged so far. Mrs. Gable didn't say a word to anyone, but she stopped making the 10 o'clock morning coffee in the kitchen and started leaving the kettle on the stove in the second-floor hallway, along with 2 cups every single day, without making a comment. Raymond noticed too, but what he noticed was different. Raymond began to notice that Arthur was more present in the main house, that he went out to the fields earlier and came back earlier than in previous months, that on the rare occasions when he ate lunch in absolute silence, as he had always done, there was now a moment when his eyes would drift to the middle of the window, staring at the pasture outside with an expression Raymond had never seen on his brother-in-law's face, and which made him uncomfortable in a way that took him a few days to name. Arthur was thinking about something that had nothing to do with the ranch. This was a problem. Raymond had arrived at the Drummond Ranch 8 years prior, during the darkest period Arthur had ever lived through. His wife, Clara, a woman of delicate health her whole life, had died of typhoid fever in an autumn that ended far too quickly, and Arthur had slipped into a darkness so deep that for a while Raymond genuinely didn't know if his brother-in-law would be able to keep going. It had been Raymond who stayed, who organized the ranch's affairs when Arthur couldn't drag himself out of his chair in the morning, who made the decisions that needed making, who made phone calls and signed papers as Arthur's proxy. During that time, Raymond had truly been necessary, and he had done the work with genuine dedication. That was what made Raymond's story complex. He wasn't a man devoid of any good qualities. There was in him a real capacity for care, which he had used with Arthur in those early years, and he possessed a practical intelligence that made the ranch's administration efficient. But there was also a weakness that grew heavier over time, the inability to be himself without being a reflection of someone else. Without Arthur's ranch, without the title of Drummond's brother-in-law, without the position of manager, Raymond didn't quite know what he was. And when life gave signs that this position might be at risk, the weakness proved stronger than his character. And over time, this position of being necessary had become a habit, then a comfort, then a dependency on both sides, just of different kinds. Arthur depended on Raymond so he wouldn't have to deal with certain things, and Raymond depended on Arthur to have a place to be, something to be, a name to use when introducing himself. Raymond Hayes, Arthur's brother-in-law, manager of the Drummond Ranch. Without that, he was just a middle-aged man with no property of his own, with debts in Bozeman he preferred not to mention, and with no prospects that brought him any real satisfaction. Because of this, for years, Raymond had carefully tended to one specific thing: keeping Arthur closed off. Not in a dramatic way, in a delicate, surgical, almost invisible way. An observation here about how so-and-so had ulterior motives. A story there about how someone else had tried to get close, just out of self-interest. A smooth comment about how Arthur needed to be careful because he was a man of means, and people saw that before they saw the man. Over the years, these comments had built into Arthur a natural distrust of anyone new, and Raymond had become the filter through which any novelty had to pass. When the negotiation of Ernest Vance's debt came up, Raymond thought it would be simple. He prepared Arthur to receive a difficult woman with a complicated temper, who would probably try to take advantage of the situation, and he prepared Sophia herself, through years of stories spread across the region, to arrive with anger and suspicion of Arthur. 2 armed sides, 2 distant sides, and him in the middle as the necessary intermediary. What he hadn't foreseen was the hallway table with the books. What he hadn't foreseen was Arthur going up to the second floor in the afternoons. What he hadn't foreseen was the expression he saw on his brother-in-law's face at the lunch window. Raymond needed to think, and fast. There was a Thursday in January when Sophia was in the library in the afternoon, in her spot by the window, with a heavy volume on the American frontier she had found on a higher shelf, and was halfway through. The winter sun was streaming through the window at an angle that gently warmed the left side of her face, and the pasture outside was covered in a low mist that settled in the valleys between the hills, making the ponderosa pines look as if they were floating. It was one of those afternoons that the Montana mountains sometimes hand out for free, quiet and beautiful, in a way that demands nothing from anyone. The library door opened. Arthur walked in. Sophia lifted her eyes from the book. He stood framed in the doorway for a moment, clearly not having expected to find her there at that hour, or perhaps having expected it and not having prepared what to do with it. There was something in those dark eyes that wasn't exactly discomfort. It was more the look of someone who isn't used to being found in places he considers his own. But there was also something else, smaller and harder to describe, which Sophia noticed but filed away. She closed the book with the marker on the right page and asked with deliberate calmness if he wanted her to leave. Arthur shook his head from side to side, said no, stepped inside, walked over to the shelf opposite the window, and started looking for something with that intense concentration people apply to books when they need a second to compose themselves. He pulled out a volume, opened it, flipped through the pages. Sophia watched him from the corner of her eye and went back to hers. They sat there in silence for about 20 minutes, each with their own book, with the winter sun pouring through the window and the low wind in the ponderosa pines outside. It was a silence different from all the other silences they had shared since Sophia arrived, less negotiated, more natural. The kind of silence that only happens when two sides stop using silence as a tool and just let it be what it is. Arthur was the first to break it. Without preamble, without lifting his eyes from the book he was holding, he said that he had seen her note about the essay on self-reliance, and that her arguments were good, but they were wrong. Sophia replied, also without lifting her eyes from her own book, that her arguments were good and they were right, and that his were the ones that were good and wrong. There was a pause. And then Arthur let out a sound that Sophia took a moment to identify because she had never heard it before. A brief, contained laugh, one that started in his nose and barely reached his mouth. A laugh that seemed to surprise the very man who produced it. Sophia looked at him. He still had his eyes on the book, but the line of his mouth was different, less straight. Sophia went back to her book. The conversation about the essay lasted 40 minutes. It wasn't an easy or cordial conversation in the conventional sense. It was a conversation between two stubborn, intelligent people who genuinely disagreed, with arguments, with counter-arguments, with quotes from the text that Sophia knew by heart and Arthur searched for on the page. In the middle of it, Mrs. Gable came upstairs with the kettle and the 2 cups, placed them on the threshold of the half-open door without stepping inside, and walked away. The two of them didn't even pause their conversation to grab the coffee. They reached for it instinctively once the kettle was there and kept right on talking. When the sun began to dip and the library light turned that bluish-grey of a winter's dusk, Arthur closed the book and stood up. He stood there for a moment, like someone searching for the natural end to something he doesn't quite know how to close. He said that her argument about Emerson's ironic tone was the most solid one, even if he didn't entirely agree. Sophia said she knew it was. Arthur left. She sat listening to his footsteps going down the stairs, and then listened to the silence that remained after the footsteps. There was something simmering inside her that she didn't want to name just yet. It was inconvenient, it was problematic, it was completely outside what she had planned to feel on that ranch. But it was there, small and insistent, like the ember that stays at the back of the wood stove after the logs catch. That ember that never really goes out. The next day, in the kitchen, while Sophia was helping with lunch, Mrs. Gable said, with her back to her, that it was good to hear Arthur talking to someone without it being about the ranch or the weather. She said it had been a long time since she'd heard it, that she had forgotten what he was like when he had someone to really talk to. Sophia didn't reply. She chopped the carrots into perfectly even pieces and held that feeling carefully inside her chest, as if it were something fragile. Raymond appeared that afternoon with an intention that Sophia didn't yet know was an intention. He came into the kitchen with that same old smile, accepted the coffee Mrs. Gable offered without enthusiasm, and joined in the general conversation for a few minutes. Then, in a tone that seemed too casual to actually be casual, he mentioned that he had found out that Sophia's father, Ernest Vance, had tried to contest the debt amount with a second clerk before accepting the arrangement. He said this while looking out the window, not at her, like someone commenting on something of little interest. He added that Arthur had found out about it and had grown quite serious over it, because it was the sort of thing that looked like dishonesty, even if perhaps it wasn't. Sophia stayed quiet. Then she said she knew nothing about any attempt to contest the debt. Raymond shrugged and said that maybe she really didn't know, that it was probably something her father hadn't told her so as not to worry her. He finished his coffee, said his thanks, and left. Sophia stood looking at Raymond's empty cup on the table. There was something in that story that rubbed her the wrong way, a tone of evidence presented at the exact moment it would cause the most effect. But she had no way to verify it, not there, not right then. And the doubt, small and sharp, remained. In the library that afternoon, Arthur didn't show up. Sophia stayed until the light faded, reading alone, her ear slightly tilted toward the door in a way she noticed and recognized with irritation. She closed the book earlier than she intended and went to her room. That night there was something she didn't expect. She was in her room, with the oil lamp turned down low, when she heard, through the window facing the south side of the house, the sound of an instrument. An old acoustic guitar, played with a technique that wasn't that of a professional musician, but of someone who had been playing for a long time, with that confidence that comes from years of having hands on the wood. The melody was ancient, one of those old folk tunes that drift up from the valleys but reach the mountains through the freighters, carrying that specific melancholy of someone singing about distance and longing. Sophia walked slowly to the window and opened a crack. On the back porch, Arthur was sitting on a wooden chair, his back to the house, playing out to the dark pasture and the stars showing through the winter clouds. He wasn't playing for anyone. He was playing for himself, for the cold, for the ponderosa pines out there. She stood listening for a time she couldn't measure. The guitar had a warm, full-bodied sound that didn't match the winter, but somehow suited it perfectly. She rested her forehead lightly against the window frame and stayed there until the music stopped, until Arthur stood up and went in through the back door, until his footsteps faded down the inner hallway. She closed the window very quietly. She sat on the edge of her bed in the dark for a good while, her heart doing something she was starting to be unable to ignore. And she thought, for the first time since she had arrived at that ranch, that perhaps the man she had met wasn't the man she had heard about. That maybe they were two entirely different people using the same name, and that she needed to be very careful, because the difference between those two people was enormous, and she still didn't know for sure which one was real, or if both were, in different ways, the same man that no one had managed to see completely until now. That week Raymond kept his eyes wide open. He started showing up at night before dinner with the excuse of reviewing the ranch's ledgers with Arthur, taking up the room where the two of them sometimes stayed, talking after dinner with more frequency. Once he walked into the library with the excuse of looking for an almanac and stayed longer than necessary, staring at the shelves with one eye and at Sophia with the other. She noticed. She kept reading. On a rainy afternoon in January, when the fine winter drizzle had started before lunch and kept on going into the late afternoon, halting all outdoor work, Sophia was sweeping the second-floor hallway when Arthur walked out of the library and almost bumped into her because she was right in front of the door without realizing it. They stood less than 3 feet apart, and there was a second where neither of them moved. The smell of rain and pine drifted through the hallway window, the light breeze swaying the sheer curtains. Arthur looked at her with those dark eyes she had learned to read a little, and there was something in them she hadn't seen before, or that she had seen but hadn't allowed herself to name yet. There was attention, the kind of attention that isn't evaluation or surveillance. It is interest. It is the gaze of someone who is truly seeing. He said, with a voice slightly lower than usual, that she had seen the last book he left, a dense volume on the American frontier. Sophia answered that she had, and that it was dense but necessary, that every American needed to read it. Arthur said he agreed, and that there was a specific chapter about the unforgiving plains that he thought was the most honest thing anyone had written about the interior of the country. Sophia said she knew which one it was, and that there was a sadness in it that was political and geographical at the same time, which was almost unbearable to read, but also impossible to put down. Arthur nodded, slowly, like someone acknowledging something the other person said that he also felt but had never articulated in quite that way. They stood there in the hallway for a few more seconds. Then Raymond came up the stairs. He saw the two of them, paused on the top step for a moment that was too long to be natural, and then walked up with an easy smile, asking if he had interrupted anything. Arthur said no, that he was heading out to the pasture to see if the rain had stopped. He went down the stairs. Sophia went back to her broom. Raymond stood looking at her with that smile that provided no warmth. And she understood, with a clarity that arrived slowly but arrived fully intact, that the man in front of her was dangerous in a specific way. Not the danger of someone who strikes you, but the danger of someone who chooses what you hear and what you don't hear, and does it so well that you never know when you are being steered. She needed to be more careful, not with Arthur, with Raymond. In the second week of January, on a morning when Arthur had gone out early to visit a neighboring rancher who had a problem with the property fence, Raymond called Sophia into the dining room with a formality she hadn't seen from him until then. He said he needed to talk about a matter involving the debt and the agreement. Sophia sat in the chair, folded her hands on the table, and remained quiet. Raymond said he had found out, through an acquaintance in Bozeman, that Sophia's father had tried, before making the deal with Arthur, to find another creditor who would buy out the debt for a lesser amount, which in practice would be a way to deceive Arthur, to reduce the amount he received. He said Arthur had recently discovered this and was considering revisiting the terms of the agreement. That he wasn't telling her this to worry her. He was telling her because he believed she deserved to know, that it was better for her to be prepared in case Arthur brought the subject up. Sophia listened to everything. She thanked him for the information with a calmness that cost her more than she let show. When Raymond left, she sat in the chair for a long time, listening to the fire in the kitchen stove and the rain that had started falling again outside. There were two possibilities. Her father had done this, and she didn't know, or her father hadn't done anything, and Raymond was making it up. She needed to find out which was the truth, and to find out, she needed someone who knew. She needed to send a letter to Aunt Margaret, the only person in Bozeman who told the truth without dressing it up. She wrote the letter that night carefully, asking her aunt if she knew of any attempt by her father to renegotiate the debt with another creditor before the agreement. She asked Mrs. Gable to put it in with the ranch's next outgoing mail to town, which happened on Thursdays, with the boy who delivered and picked up packages. Mrs. Gable took the letter without asking any questions, which Sophia appreciated. The wait for the response was long. 8 days. 8 days in which the doubt planted by Raymond sat fermenting, and in which Sophia ran into Arthur in the library twice, and both times there was something different, a new distance that wasn't there before. It was subtle. Arthur hadn't clearly changed his behavior, but there was a reserve that didn't exist before, a careful choice of words that she noticed, as if someone had told him something about her that he didn't quite know how to handle yet. On the following Monday, Aunt Margaret's letter arrived along with the other deliveries. Sophia opened it in her room. Her aunt wrote with the directness of a schoolteacher who sees no reason to beat around the bush. She said she knew Ernest Vance well, and that the Drummond brother-in-law, Raymond, had been circulating through town over the last few months. That she had heard him telling at least 2 people that Sophia had gone to work for Arthur begrudgingly, and that her father was dishonest. As for the attempt to seek another creditor, there was no truth to it. Ernest had tried to sell a piece of his land to pay off the debt. Nothing worked, and he had accepted the arrangement with Drummond because it was the only path forward. She added that she was doing well and sent her love. Sophia read the letter twice. Then she folded it carefully and sat on the edge of the bed for a considerable amount of time, holding the folded paper in her hand, listening to the rain outside, and organizing within herself the full extent of what she had just understood. Raymond had lied to Arthur about her. He had lied to her about her father. He had spread lies through the town before her arrival. He was working both sides with the same hand, planting what he needed to plant, so that both of them would remain suspicious of each other, so that the space between them would remain occupied by him. For years, probably. He had been doing this for years. She stayed quiet for a long time, feeling a cold anger that was different from the hot anger she had brought from Bozeman. This one was cleaner, more precise. This one knew exactly where it was going. The next day, Sophia didn't go to the library. She focused on the housework with a concentration that was different from her usual. The concentration of someone who is thinking about something else entirely while moving their hands. Mrs. Gable looked at her a few times, but didn't ask. In the afternoon, when she was mopping the second-floor hallway, Arthur stepped out of the library, and she said, without preamble and without taking her eyes off the mop on the floor, that she needed to talk to him about something. Arthur stopped. He said he was listening. Sophia stood up straight, turned to him, and said she preferred a seated conversation, without being rushed. Arthur looked at her for a second. Then he opened the library door and made room for her to pass. They stood on opposite sides of the large library table, Sophia facing the window with the pasture behind her, and Arthur facing her, with the low, late afternoon light illuminating the left side of his face. Sophia placed Aunt Margaret's letter on the table, but didn't push it across just yet. Arthur looked at the paper, but said nothing. If you've made it to this point in the story, leave a comment here, letting me know what you think. It really helps me to keep bringing stories like this, Sophia began. She said that before she said anything, she needed him to know one thing about her, that she wasn't the type to make accusations without proof, and that what she was about to say wasn't an accusation, it was information, and he could do whatever he thought was right with it. Arthur nodded once, slowly, with that total attention he gave to things when he decided they were worth his attention. She told him everything. She told him what Raymond had said about her father's attempt to renegotiate the debt. She told him she had written to her aunt asking for confirmation. She told him what her aunt had replied. She slid the letter across the table. Arthur picked it up and read it carefully. He reread the middle section. He placed it back on the table without folding it. He stayed silent for a time that Sophia allowed to stretch out. The fire was burning low in the small stone fireplace in the corner of the library, an orange ember pulsing slowly. Outside, the ponderosa pines swayed with the south wind, the coldest wind of all, and the late afternoon light was turning blue through the windows, that winter dusk light that has a quality of confession that makes everything just a little more honest. Arthur said, with a voice lower than usual but no slower, that Raymond had told him, the week prior, that Sophia had arrived with the intention of working as little as possible, and that she was trying to get close to him with ulterior motives related to the property, that he hadn't completely believed it, but that it had felt like a stone in his shoe, the kind of thing you know shouldn't bother you but does. Sophia showed no reaction because what she felt in that moment was more complex than anger. It was a specific sadness, the sadness of knowing that a lie had reached a place she didn't want it to reach. Arthur went on to say that this wasn't the first time Raymond had said something like that about someone, that looking back, with the eyes this conversation was opening, there was a pattern. That there were at least 3 people Arthur had kept at a distance over the last few years because of stories Raymond had told him, and that now, with this new perspective, he no longer knew what was real. He said this with an honesty that had something painful about it, the honesty of someone recognizing a profound vulnerability. Sophia said she understood that she herself had arrived at that ranch, prepared to hate a man she had heard described as calculating and cold, and that what she had found was completely different. That it took time to stop looking at the man in front of her while searching for the man she had imagined. That sometimes it's hard to let reality replace the story you were told before you even had the chance to see for yourself. Arthur raised his eyes to hers. There was something in them she hadn't seen before in that clarity. It wasn't vulnerability, it was an opening, a small crack, newly formed, in a place that had been sealed shut for far too long. And there was also, she recognized, something resembling relief, the kind of relief from someone who can finally stop carrying something all by themselves. He said, in that voice she had learned to read over the past few months, that Raymond had joined the ranch at a time when he wasn't well enough to judge anything. That gratitude and dependency had mixed in a way that became hard to separate later on. That he knew something had been wrong for a while, but when you get used to letting someone filter the world for you, you become afraid of what you'll find if you remove the filter. Sophia stood looking at him for a moment. She said she knew how that worked, that she herself had arrived with a thick filter built from years of repeated stories about him, and that it had taken time and reason to start peeling back the layers. She said that the Arthur who truly existed was considerably different from the Arthur they had described to her, and that the different one was better. There was a pause. The ember in the fireplace popped once. Arthur looked at the window for a moment, then looked back at her, and there on his face was the most honest expression she had seen since she arrived. He wasn't calculating or protecting himself. He was just there, present, without the glass. He said she was the most direct person he had met in a very long time, and that he didn't quite know what to do with that, but he was grateful for it. Sophia replied that she knew exactly what he should do with it. That he should do what anyone does when they discover an important truth, act according to it. Night arrived in that library, with the 2 of them still talking, and Mrs. Gable came upstairs with a tray of hot tea and fresh bread and butter, which she set on the table without saying a word, wearing a half smile that was the most satisfied Sophia had seen on her since she arrived. What needed to be said about Raymond was still to come. But that night, with the hot tea and the books all around, and the cold wind in the ponderosa pines outside, the 2 people in that room finally saw each other without what someone else had placed between them. And that was enough, for that night, to keep the rest of the world outside the library door. Raymond wasn't invited to dinner that night. Arthur had said dryly that he was going to eat with the household, and that Raymond could eat in the ranch hand's bunkhouse. It was unusual enough for Raymond to understand that something had changed, but he didn't yet know the extent of what had changed. In the days that followed, Arthur was quieter than usual, but it was a different silence than before. It wasn't the silence of someone with nothing to say. It was the silence of someone processing something important, reorganizing what he knows about his own history. Sophia left him in that silence out of respect. She knew what it meant to need time to unlearn something you had believed for years. She herself was going through something similar. The anger she had brought from Bozeman had turned into something else over those weeks, something more complex and more honest. She was still there because of a debt that wasn't hers. She would still return to the homestead when the agreement was over. There was still an objective, real distance between her and the tall man with dark eyes who played the guitar on the porch for the winter stars. But there were also those 40 minutes of conversation about Emerson in the hallway, and the folded notes on the little table, and the tea that Mrs. Gable left in the library without anyone asking, and the brief laugh she had coaxed out of him that January afternoon, which was probably the most beautiful thing she had heard in a long time. There was something between them that didn't have a name yet, because neither of them had dared to give it one, and as long as it didn't have a name, it was easier to carry on. Arthur went to Raymond on a Saturday morning, while his brother-in-law was inspecting the south barn. Sophia wasn't present, but Mrs. Gable was, outside the barn, gathering herbs from the nearby bed, and she heard part of what was said. Arthur was direct. He asked Raymond about the Vance family and what he had said about them. Raymond tried his usual smile, tried his usual casual tone, said he had only passed along what he knew. Arthur asked where he had learned it. Raymond said from town, from trusted sources. Arthur said he had verified it and that the information was false. There was a silence. Arthur then said a few more things in a lower voice that Mrs. Gable couldn't make out, but she heard the tone. And the tone was that of someone ending something that should have been ended a long time ago. Raymond walked out of the barn with his smile erased for the first time in years. He went straight to his room in the manager's quarters, and Mrs. Gable from the kitchen window saw the light on late into the night. The next day, Raymond wasn't at breakfast. He wasn't at lunch. The room in the quarters had its bed made and the suitcases missing, which meant the suitcases had gone with him. Arthur found out before dinner, from the foreman. He stood in the living room for a while with the expression of someone checking how they feel, like someone touching a wound carefully to gauge what still hurts. There was sadness there, of that Sophia had no doubt, because 8 years of shared life don't dissolve without leaving a trace, even when those 8 years were built on crooked foundations. Arthur had kept that man around out of real gratitude, out of a gratitude that had genuinely existed during a difficult period in his life, and discovering that someone you owed gratitude to had used that position dishonestly was a specific kind of pain, not the same as an enemy's betrayal, but deeper, because it mixed the loss with a re-evaluation of everything that had been built together. Arthur stood up, walked into the kitchen, grabbed a piece of bread and butter that Mrs. Gable promptly handed to him with that gesture of someone who understands that feeding is also an act of care that goes beyond the stomach, and said he was going to take a walk in the pasture before it got dark. Sophia was on the porch when Arthur walked past. He stopped. He stood looking out at the pasture for a moment, the bread in his hand and the late afternoon light on his shoulders. That golden low light of late February that hits sideways and makes everything sharper than in the middle of the day. He said without looking at her that the situation with Raymond had been resolved, that he would talk to her about the details later, but that she needed to know that what Raymond had told him about her and her family was a lie, and that Arthur knew it, and that it was resolved. Sophia said she knew it was a lie. Arthur said he knew that she knew. He stood in the same spot for another moment, looking out at the fields where the prairie grass was starting to bend with the south wind. Then he walked out into the pasture. Sophia stood on the porch, looking at the ponderosa pines on the horizon for a long time after he left. The dusk was turning pink on the highest peaks, that specific pink of late February in the mountains that is unlike any other pink, more intense and briefer, as if the sky knew it didn't have much time and made a point of using all its color. The wind was cold and smelled of damp pine and earth that was beginning to thaw from the winter ice. She put her hands in her apron pockets and let that moment be what it was, with no rush to know what came next, and she realized that this ability to be in the present moment without calculating the next was something the Drummond Ranch had taught her, slowly, over those months that had started with so much internal noise and were arriving at a place much quieter than she had ever thought possible. Then came what came, not suddenly. It was gradual, like the spring that was still far off, but that you could already feel in the quality of the wind, in the way the light shifted in the final days of January. The conversation they had started in the library continued, but it moved outside the library. It moved to the hallway, to the porch, to the kitchen table, when Mrs. Gable had already gone to bed, and the two of them stayed up with tea and the oil lamp, talking about anything and everything, about books, and about ranching, and about Bozeman, and about the wide American West they both knew only from the inside, from the stories people told when they arrived from other parts. Arthur talked about his father's ranch, about his childhood in the mountains, about the way the winter of '31 had arrived differently from the rest, deeper, slower. Sophia talked about Aunt Margaret and the habit of reading, about the homestead's garden that she knew plant by plant, about the long Bozeman winters where the fog lingered for days. And in the spaces between the things that were said, there were the things that hadn't been said yet, but which were there all the same, perhaps more present, precisely because they had no words. There was an afternoon when the two of them were on the porch, and a fine rain started suddenly, the kind that comes without warning, and Arthur got up to grab the woolen blanket from the inside chair, and when he returned, he draped half of it over Sophia's shoulders without asking, a gesture so natural that they both sat in silence for a second, acknowledging what that gesture meant. Arthur kept the other half over his own shoulders, sitting on the bench next to her, and the fine rain kept falling on the field, and the smell of wet earth settled between them like a good presence. Sophia said, looking at the rain, that she had a question about the chapter by Thoreau they had discussed the week before. Arthur answered her question. She counter-argued. He replied again, and so the afternoon passed, with the shared blanket and the continuous rain, and neither of them said anything about the blanket, and neither of them needed to. There was a morning when Arthur was in the library, and Sophia walked in unannounced because she had forgotten a bookmark on the chair the day before, and when he lifted his eyes from his book and saw her there was something in that look that she couldn't deny this time. A direct and clear thing that had been there for quite some time, but that morning, in the white light of approaching spring, was completely undisguised. It was affection. It was the kind of look that isn't calculated, isn't performative, it's just true. Sophia grabbed her bookmark, she said good morning, she walked out. And she went to her room instead of the kitchen and leaned against her closed door for about 2 minutes, clutching the bookmark in her hand, feeling her heart do things she could no longer call inconvenient. There was a night, in the second week of February, when the cold was at the deepest peak of winter and the wind was too strong to be out on the porch. They were in the large living room with the fire roaring, each with their own book, in a silence that was the comfortable silence of two people who have grown accustomed to each other's presence, the best kind of silence there is. And Arthur lowered his book to his lap and looked at her without the shield of reading, without the distance that books sometimes provide, and said, in that low voice she had learned to recognize as the most sincere one he had, that he wanted to tell her something, Sophia closed her book as well. She stayed quiet, waiting. Arthur said that when he found out he was going to take in Ernest Vance's daughter to work on the ranch, he had arrived with a preconceived notion. That he had arrived prepared to confirm what Raymond had told him, and that he was wrong. He said he was wrong to believe without verifying, and that it was costly to realize that, but that he did realize it. And that what he had realized since then, over the course of those months, was that Sophia Vance was the most honest and courageous person to walk onto that ranch in a long time, perhaps in the longest time he could remember. And that he didn't know exactly where this was going to end up, and he wasn't going to rush it faster than he should, but that he needed to say it. Sophia sat looking at him for a time she didn't measure. The fire popped in the corner. Outside, the wind in the ponderosa pines made that sound she already knew by heart. Then she said, with an honesty that belongs to someone who allows themselves to be truly seen, that she too had arrived with a preconceived notion, that she had also been wrong, and that the Arthur she had met was very different and, she said with a smile that slowly began to show, considerably harder to ignore than would be convenient. Arthur stayed looking at her for a long moment. And then he let out that laugh, not the brief and contained one from the library on that January afternoon. A real, open laugh that transformed his entire face and made Sophia feel as if something very heavy and very old had broken loose in the air of that room. She laughed too, and the fire kept burning and the wind kept rushing through the ponderosa pines, and that night neither of them went to their rooms before midnight. In the days that followed, there was a different quality to everything between them. It wasn't declared, it hadn't been put into formal words yet, but it was present the way daylight is present, too obvious to need naming. Mrs. Gable watched with the calm satisfaction of someone who plants seeds and then watches them grow. The ranch hands noticed that the boss had a different way of walking around the property, more present, less closed off, as if windows had been opened in a place where the air had grown stale. And then, on a late February afternoon, Arthur went to his office, fetched the debt contract for Ernest Vance, and walked over to Sophia in the kitchen. He placed the document on the table next to the basin of dried beans she was sorting, and said he wanted to talk about the arrangement. Sophia stopped sorting the beans. She stayed quiet, waiting. Arthur said he had reflected on the situation and that there were several things that needed to be said. The first was that Raymond had drafted the contract with conditions that were harsher than Arthur would have proposed had he drafted it himself. The second was that, given the circumstances, he believed the debt had already been sufficiently honored. And the third was that Sophia could return to Bozeman whenever she wished, that the debt was considered settled as of that day, and that the document could be torn up or kept, however she preferred. Sophia stood looking at the document on the table. She was feeling things she didn't quite know how to organize, all at the same time. Relief for her father, a gratitude that was hard to swallow because it also tasted like debt, and something much deeper that wasn't exactly either of those. She said this was too generous, and she didn't know if she could accept it like this without it feeling like charity. Arthur said it wasn't charity, it was correction, that the value had been served in ways he recognized as true, and that the document no longer reflected the reality of the situation. She looked at him, he looked at her. And there in the kitchen, with the beans in the basin and the contract on the table, hung a question that neither of them put into words, but that both heard with absolute clarity. Sophia said she would need a few days to think about it. Arthur said he knew she would, and that she had all the time she needed, that the library was still available, and that the chair near the window was saved for her. Sophia watched him leave through the kitchen door. She stood looking at the document on the table for a while longer. Then she went back to the beans, methodically, bean by bean, and let her thoughts settle with the calm of someone who knows that things worth having are never to be rushed. She stayed another 3 weeks, not out of obligation, by choice. Those 3 weeks were different from all the previous weeks, in a way that was hard to describe but easy to feel. Without the weight of the contract on her shoulders, Sophia moved around the ranch with a different lightness, not the lightness of someone free of everything, but the lightness of someone free of the specific burden she had carried. She still worked, because she was who she was, and because the work was good, and because the ranch functioned well with her in it. But there was a different quality to the work, less to prove, and more simply being present. Arthur noticed. There were moments when he saw her on the porch hanging laundry, or in the garden picking the last of the winter cabbage, and there was something in his gaze that she hadn't yet seen in the face of any other man. An attention that wasn't possessive, wasn't evaluative. It was simply the look of someone who enjoys seeing, who finds what he sees worthy of attention. Sophia had grown up in a world where men's gazes toward women were almost always instrumentalized in some way. The gaze of someone who wants something, or the gaze of someone evaluating if they will want something. His was different, and it took her a few days to figure out what to do with a different kind of gaze. She wrote to her father telling him the debt was settled and that she would return soon. She wrote a longer letter to Aunt Margaret, which her aunt would later say she had read 3 times because there was something in it that wasn't in the words, but that the words revealed anyway. Much like the shape of a package reveals what is inside before you open it. She spent those days with a different presence, and that lightness was as physical as the cold of late February, as real as the smell of firewood in the morning stove. Arthur didn't push anything. He didn't say anything that shouldn't be said at the right time. He was a man who had learned, the hard way, the cost of acting before understanding. But in the small gestures lay what the words hadn't yet spoken. The book he left open in the library to a page he knew she would love. The one about the western plains with a description of pines that seemed written right out of Montana. The cup of chamomile tea that appeared on the hallway table on a night when she had mentioned, in passing, that she had a headache, which meant he had heard something she hadn't even said to him directly. She had said it to Mrs. Gable, which meant Mrs. Gable had passed it along, which meant there was a complicity in that kitchen that Sophia found simultaneously slightly conspiratorial and entirely adorable. The time he adjusted the woolen blanket around her shoulders on the back porch without thinking, and they both sat in silence for a second, acknowledging how natural it already was, and neither of them pulled back from the gesture, neither pretended it hadn't happened. On an afternoon in March, with the spring still very timid but already present in the buds on the ponderosa pines and the different scent of the wind, Sophia went into the library and found Arthur there. She stood in the doorway for a moment. Then she said, with that direct clarity that was part of who she was, and that he had learned to recognize as one of her most valuable traits, that she was leaving the following week, that she needed to return to the homestead and her father and her siblings, that she had those responsibilities, and they were real, and she wasn't going to pretend they weren't. Arthur said he knew, that he understood. Sophia said she knew he understood, and that was why she wanted to say one thing before leaving. She said she had arrived at that ranch with a small suitcase and a lot of hatred, and she was leaving with the same small suitcase and without the hatred, and that there was a space where that hatred used to be, which was now filled by something else that she wasn't going to give a name to just yet, because it wasn't the time, but it was there. And he could do whatever he thought was right with that. Arthur stood up, carefully placed his book back on the shelf, turned to her and said he knew exactly what he wanted to do with it. He said he was going to do the thing that anyone does with something worth having, guard it carefully and not let it be lost. He said there was a distance between Bozeman and the Drummond Ranch that wasn't small, but it wasn't insurmountable, and that March was a good month for riding. Sophia stood looking at him for a moment with those deep green eyes he had learned to read over the months, and there in them was the smile she sometimes allowed to reach only her eyes, not her mouth. She said March was a good month, and that she was going to leave the green ribbon marker in the Emerson book on the shelf, waiting. Arthur said the marker would be kept very safe. Sophia left the next morning, with her small suitcase and her aunt's Jane Austen collection, and her heart in a condition she didn't have the exact right words to describe, but which she recognized as good, as very good, like the condition of someone who arrived at a place expecting to find stone and found water instead. Ben the teamster drove down the road once again, as if by some twist of fate that Mrs. Gable had likely arranged. Arthur stood on the porch as the wagon made its way down the rocky path. Sophia didn't look back this time either, but this time it wasn't containment, it was a promise. It was the absolute certainty of someone who knows she doesn't need to look back at what isn't going anywhere. Mrs. Gable stood beside Arthur on the porch until the wagon rounded the bend and disappeared into the morning fog. Then she went to the kitchen to make coffee without saying a word, because there was nothing that needed to be said. March arrived with the spring opening slowly in the mountains, the green buds on the ponderosa pines, and the fields shedding their winter grey for a green that is timid at first and then becomes impossible to ignore. Arthur appeared at Ernest Vance's homestead on an afternoon of clear sunshine, on horseback, carrying a basket of fruit that Mrs. Gable had sent. Ernest received him with the dignity of someone who carries shame but refuses to be broken by it, and Arthur treated the man with the respect that Raymond would never have allowed him to show, because Raymond needed the debt to remain a debt. Sophia was in the garden when she heard the horse. She turned, and then she stood completely still for a second, with dirt on her hands and the sun in her eyes, watching Arthur Drummond dismount his horse in the yard of her homestead with that posture she knew every detail of. He saw her. He took off his hat. She wiped her hands on her apron, and the two walked toward each other with that natural ease of people who have already crossed the hardest distance, and all that's left is simply the path. What came next was built with the patience and honesty of both of them, with no rush, no shortcuts. Arthur returned to the homestead in April on horseback, with an excuse that was transparent enough for Ernest to smile inwardly when he heard it, and which Sophia let slide without comment because there was something incredibly gentle in the idea that a man who didn't need an excuse invented one anyway. Perhaps because he needed some rite of passage to cross the distance between what was and what was becoming. He stayed the whole afternoon. He talked with Ernest about raising cattle and about the winter that had passed. He talked with Aunt Margaret about Thomas Hardy, because her aunt had read a passage that Sophia herself had quoted in a letter, and he sat on the porch of the homestead with Sophia as dusk fell, the two of them looking out over a different pasture. The pasture of the Vance homestead, which was smaller and steeper and had a different view, but which possessed that same quality of productive silence that helps a person think clearer. Sophia went to the ranch in May, this time by explicit invitation, with the practical justification of helping Mrs. Gable with the big spring cleaning she did every May, a cleaning that had happened every May for many years without Sophia being a part of it, and which somehow had become, in that specific year, an event that demanded her presence. She stayed 5 days. During those 5 days, the ranch felt different to her, not like a piece of property or a place of work, but a place where she belonged, and that feeling was too new to be ignored and too honest to be discarded. By June, there was a certainty between them that required no further verification. It was the certainty of two adults who had arrived at the same point through twisting paths and who recognized with a slightly unexpected and very welcome clarity that this point was exactly where they wanted to stay. The wedding was in September 1932, on an afternoon of bright sunshine that arrived unexpectedly after a week of rain, as if the weather itself had decided to cooperate. At the Drummond Ranch, with the porch decorated with wildflowers that Mrs. Gable had picked herself, having gone out early into the fields with a basket on her arm, coming back with wild daisies and native lavender and a few sprigs of lemon balm that smelled like everything home should smell like. Ernest Vance was wearing a suit borrowed from his neighbor Ben, with eyes that didn't stay dry for long, not out of sadness, but with that gentle crying of parents who watch their children arrive at a place they couldn't take them to, having arrived there on their own and through a merit that owed nothing to anyone. Aunt Margaret had her Jane Austen book tucked under her arm because she never went anywhere without a book, and she made a point of standing next to Mrs. Gable during the ceremony, and the two formed a partnership of wise older women who laughed together at a joke none of the other guests understood, but which was probably about the bride and groom. It was a small ceremony, with the people who mattered and without the ones who didn't, which is always the best kind of ceremony. The reverend from the parish in Red Lodge had come the day before and stayed at the neighbouring homestead, and arrived in the morning with a voice well suited for a fine sermon and a calm temperament made for folks who don't like exaggeration. Arthur stood at the front, in a dark suit with his usual posture, but in his dark eyes, when Sophia reached the porch wearing a white linen dress that Aunt Margaret had sewn over 2 weeks, there was an expression that Mrs. Gable would later describe to herself as the face of a man seeing for the first time something that had always been there. Arthur played the acoustic guitar at the end of the night for Sophia and for the fields he loved. And this time it wasn't for himself or for the silence, it was for her, who sat listening with her heart more at peace than it had been in a long time, her head resting lightly on his shoulder as she looked out at the dark fields and the September stars, which were already warmer than those of January. The Drummond Ranch with Sophia in it was a different place from every angle. The windows were truly thrown open, not just the wooden ones, but the other kind, the ones that exist in the very nature of a house, and a house with its windows thrown open has a different sound, a different breathing, and whoever arrived could feel it before they knew how to name it. The library gained new books every time someone went into town, and on a winter afternoon in 1934, Sophia went up to the second floor, counted the shelves, and realized there were more books there than when she first arrived, which was no small thing. Mrs. Gable began teaching the local young women who wanted to learn how to cook on Saturday afternoons, a practice that turned into a tradition. And those Saturday afternoons in the Drummond Ranch kitchen became over time a point of reference in the region, one of those places where things happen naturally because there is a genuine generosity behind them. Ernest Vance, with his homestead reorganized and the debt vanished from his life, went back to being the man he was before the hardships had bent him. A good man whom life had tried to twist, but whose daughter had held firm at a moment when it would have been easier to just let him break. When he visited the ranch, which he began to do regularly, there was a mutual respect between him and Arthur that had grown unpretentiously, the kind that grows slowly between people who discover each other's integrity simply by being in each other's presence. The years went by with that specific quality of good years, which aren't years without hardship, but are years when hardship encounters two sides who face it together. There were harsh winters to plan for and beautiful springs to harvest. There were debates about books that continued throughout their lives, up in that second-floor library and at the kitchen table and on the porch with the wind in the ponderosa pines. Debates that were never just about books, but were always also about everything of human life contained within those pages. There was the gesture of the shared blanket on the porch that became, over the years, their own private symbol of something that never needed more words than the few spoken on that February afternoon. the symbol of two people who learned that sharing doesn't mean losing half, it means having double. Years later, when life was different and time had left gentle marks on both their faces, Sophia would often sit in the library in the late winter afternoons, in the same spot by the window, with the pasture outside and the ancient ponderosa pines on the horizon. And sometimes Arthur would walk in without making a sound with his footsteps, just as he always did, and he would stand in the doorway for a moment, just like on that afternoon in January of 1932. Except that now, in his dark eyes, there was the expression of a man who isn't standing behind any glass, a man who is completely there, completely present, completely without a filter. And Sophia would lift her eyes from her book, and in her gaze was the understanding of two people who met armed for war and discovered that the war had never existed, that it had been invented by someone who needed them to remain apart, and that everything they had built in the space where the hatred used to be was more solid than anything that could have been built any other way, because sometimes the story they tell about us isn't our story, and finding someone who is willing to look for the true story instead of settling for the one they've already heard is one of the rarest and most beautiful things life has to offer. And in 1931, in the freezing mountains of Montana, with fog in the ponderosa pines and a small suitcase and a lot of hatred, Sophia Vance went to find just that, without planning it, without wanting it, in the most unlikely place imaginable. On the ranch of a man she was sent to hate, and who was never the same again after she arrived. Nor was she.